everyone, and welcome to what I hope will be a fruitful discussion for the next hour or so on what's it about? It's basically about how to talk about Europe in a way that makes people feel less like banging their heads on the table every 5 minutes. My name is Katy Lee, I'll be your moderator, and the title of this conversation is, if I was going to start again, I would start with culture. Now, that is a quote that is usually attributed to Jean Monnet, who's one of the founding fathers of the European Union. He didn't actually say it, but that doesn't mean that it's not an interesting idea. The idea behind it, of course, being, we spent decades and decades trying to build a closer Europe by integrating our economies, which is great. But at the same time, we live in a union of 28 countries which don't really feel like one collected place. If you talk to people in Spain or Luxembourg, they will most likely tell you they are Spanish or they're from Luxembourg. They're not going to tell you they're European. Now, again, that's not necessarily a terrible thing, but it's kind of interesting to think about this idea. If we had spent more effort over the last 50 or so years building a closer culture, would we feel more together as one Europe now? And especially with European elections coming up soon, if you talk to most people in the streets in any country in the European Union, they're probably going to tell you not really following the elections, they're not really interested, and Europe feels probably quite far away from their lives. Now, this is an issue that's really close to my heart, personally. For the last 18 months, I've been the co-host of a podcast called The Europeans. I'm British, and I set it up with a British friend who lives in Amsterdam. And we launched this podcast after the Brexit referendum. We were doing a lot of soul searching, asking, why did this happen? Why does Europe feel so alienated from people's lives? And we quickly came to the conclusion that one of the many reasons for Brexit is that Europe feels like something that is boring, and it feels like something that is far away. And even for me, as someone who's really interested in Europe, when I think about Europe, when I think about the European Union, I think of like an old white man wearing a suit most of the time. I don't know if that's something that is the same for you guys, but I'm really interested to hear a little bit about what your kind of first impressions are when I say Europe to you and when I say European Union to you. But first of all, can I just start by asking you all to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Edwin Korver. I work for a record company called News, based in Ghent, quite a big independent record company. As a hobby, I DJ, and the 26th of May, I'm running as a candidate for the European Parliament for the first time for the Flemish Socialist Party, sp.a.
Hello, I'm Ludovic Lamant. I'm a French journalist and I'm specialized in EU affairs, as we say. I've been living here in Brussels from 2012 to 2017 or something like that. And I work for Mediapart, which is a paywall website in France, investigation website mainly. And I'm also invited because I published a book, I guess, on the architecture of Brussels. Whoa.
In the spotlight.
Yeah.
My name is Maxime, Maxime Calligaro. I am French too. I used to work in the European institutions for years. I used to write speeches for politicians. And then I quit, not because I hated Europe or the EU, but because my wife had found a job on the other side of the earth in Burma, so I became a journalist. And I had the time to write a crime novel about the EU, so a crime novel set in the European Parliament, and I believe this is why I've been invited also. And I'm now co-hosting a show on France Inter et RTBF La Première. A French journalist told me that both of us could save Europe if we had interesting stories to tell about the EU. So here I am on a monthly show trying to explain EU affairs in a funny, perhaps witty way. And in the meantime, my wife came back from Burma, so we're happily living back together in Europe. Oh, and I'm writing a TV series also about the European Parliament.
Excellent.
Hi, I'm Bobbie. I'm a rapper from the UK. I produce as well. I think the reason I got invited here is because I've been doing like a little European tour the last few months, kind of ducking in and out. And yeah, I wrote a really angry song about Brexit when it happened, so I think that's why I'm here as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about that song? What the sentiment was behind it?
Well, I hadn't slept for 3 days because I was so annoyed about Brexit. I think we just got drunk for quite a while after it happened. And I wrote it. It's called like Great Britain. It's basically about kind of the illusion and the lies behind the campaign about of Brexit, and kind of how the British public, I personally feel at that point as well, kind of fell for it. And yeah, that's what the song's about, with a lot of anger.
So when I say European Union to you, Bobbie, as opposed to Brexit, like what's the first thing that comes into your head?
Literally just Brexit, honestly. Like it's it's been so kind of rammed down our throats in the UK that it's kind of hard to think of much else, because it's literally all we see every single day in the newspapers, every time you turn on the TV, every time you hear Theresa May speak, pretty much. But also, for me personally, the EU kind of meant freedom before. So yeah, freedom as well.
I think it's quite hard as Brits for us to see the European Union as anything but Brexit right now. But I imagine that's probably very different for the other people on this panel who are not British. Edwin, when I ask you, what do you think of when you think about Europe? What do you think?
I think both of the European Union, which is like the communion of 28 states with that makes a lot of the legislation, almost 30% of the legislation that is working here in Belgium is from European origin, which is really important because a lot of the big problems that we're facing at the moment need European answers, like fair taxing, like climate. And on the other hand, the cultural diversity that is Europe, with 28 different cultures with loads of languages. I don't know how many, but and with loads of different music, different arts, different films, different TV series that are really interesting and are getting well known now slowly in the different European countries, but not enough.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you say that, because obviously we do have this massive diversity of culture. What we don't really have is a huge amount of kind of shared culture. When I was talking to you guys beforehand, I think I mentioned that for me it feels sometimes like the Eurovision Song Contest is the only kind of big cultural event that we share. I am a massive fan of Eurovision. I know not everyone on this panel is, but it does seem to be the only thing where like everyone around Europe is watching this kind of like quite hilarious, bad often TV contest and laughing at it at the same time. And I've always thought that was a really nice thing. Maxime, why do you think we don't have more stuff like that?
What, Eurovision?
Well, like, well, firstly,
Thank God.
I will definitely vote for more Eurovision, but like more kind of shared cultural events that are celebrated everywhere.
Well, I mean, when you say what do you think about when I say the letters EU, you said that you only see a white man, you know, an old white man with a tie, mostly a politician. I see, because I used to work in the institutions, I see diplomats, I see technocrats, I see cleaners, I see politicians, I see the guy serving me my coffee, the barista, every time I walked into the parliament. So I see even young people like me running around serving coffees for other politicians. So I see a lot of characters worth writing about. The problem is that these stories, these characters have not been written about at all. I mean, if I ask you what is the last TV series you've watched set in Brussels in the EU institution, you can't think of anything. I've never set a foot in Washington, but I've watched blockbusters like Independence Day, I've watched The West Wing, House of Cards. So even though I've never been to the US, all these institutions seem very familiar. When it comes to the EU, you close your eyes, you see maybe 3 blue flags waving in front of a clean building, and people coming in and out. But what's happening behind these doors is something that people never write about or rap about. Mostly because people are scared. I mean, authors are awfully scared about the complexity of the European Union. It's very strange, it's remote, so why bother writing about these things? So maybe because I'm an insider and I felt that there were stories to be told, I decided to write a crime novel or just join a writing room for a TV series. TV networks have always been reluctant also to do something about the European Union, mostly because they don't understand it. or because people don't want to laugh about the European Union. They say it's a very fragile project. You know, Euroscepticism is on the rise. I'm writing a comedy show about the European Union. Why laugh about the EU? I mean, if we laugh about it, maybe we're going to destroy it. But thank God, online platforms are not changing that. Producers are more into niche topics, and therefore there was a space. I mean, they gave us money to do that, so they've taken a risk. So there is a space to write stories or at least shoot movies about the European Union, and also see because when I left the institution, I read a lot about how to write a script, how to write a novel before I started to write one. And the first lesson the first rule you learn is that drama is conflict, and the EU project is everything but conflict. When there's something, a word that is a text, when you talk about EU taxes, you can't talk about EU taxes, you talk about EU own resources. So you always try to find a way not to use the words that would actually displease either ministers or the public. So if there is no conflict, there is no story. And the EU intrinsically, fundamentally, has never been about conflict. So it's very difficult to actually get what could be a good story to tell. But they are there, and we're starting to write them.
I've got to say, as a non-Brussels person who's been kind of trying to engage with the idea of Europe over the last year and a half, I find the language that is used around this place horrible and like such a turn-off to ordinary people. Ludovic, you were a correspondent here for a very long time, and you still write a lot about the EU. What was it like arriving in Brussels and suddenly having to deal with the way that Brussels talks?
Yeah, I remember when I arrived in 2012, like walking in the European districts, I knew I would have to stay for like 4 or 5 years, and I got a bit afraid. Like I knew a bit of Brussels, but like the other Brussels, where like Belgian people do live and work and stuff like that. And I didn't know anything about this European district. And the first impression to me was that it looked like, let's say, a financial district that we could find in, let's say, I guess, in some American cities. And I couldn't find any official characteristics of, let's say, a political capital. And this was like very much surprising to me, because obviously Brussels is the capital of the EU, but also capital of Belgium and the NATO and lots of institutions. So I was like, this was the starting point of my investigation, let's say, which was trying to understand why the Brussels district, the European district, was not looking like a political capital. You were mentioning Washington, so it's like a bit an anti-Brasilia or anti-Washington capital city. And I think this has a history, and this has to do also with like a political imagination of the EU. And I think this has to do also with why the EU to so many people is a bit boring and depressing. And I just would like to add as like that at the same time, covering EU stories here has been so much exciting, because we've been working on the most political questions about saving the Eurozone, about tackling climate issues, about understanding how lobby works here in Brussels. So it's like, on one side, super exciting as far as politics is concerned, and on the other side, like the language and the way Europe is depicting itself is so depressing. So this was my starting point also.
So let's bring us back to this idea of like whether more shared culture could actually help us to feel like Europe is something that's a bit sexier than it currently is. Edwin, I know that you disagree with me when I said that Eurovision is kind of the only cultural event that feels European. And you mentioned lots of music festivals, or maybe it was someone else actually. Maybe it was Maxime, I'm not sure.
No, that was me.
It was you.
It was me. That's true, because I don't even feel the Eurovision Song Contest as a real European event, with Australia and Israel participating, which I don't feel are real European countries. But what you do see is now, especially with the festivals, I know some people organizing festivals, and for example, Pukkelpop Festival has got visitors from over 80 countries over the whole world coming over for the festival. The same with loads of showcase festivals. Tomorrow I'm going to The Great Escape. The whole of Europe is present there. The whole European music industry is present. You have like Eurosonic in Groningen, music festival that highlights European bands, tries to focus on certain European countries, brings bands over to showcase them to other organizers, promoters of festivals. So there is already a European music culture growing. It's hard to compete at the moment with the US big major label acts. And that's why it's so important that those kind of showcase festivals do exist. And Liveurope here as well.
Bobbie, you've just come back from a sort of mini European tour. Do you get the impression when you're touring in foreign capitals that your audience does feel kind of like one audience wherever you go?
A little bit more than doing it in the UK. Do you know what I mean? So like in the UK it feels very British. Do you know what I mean? Whereas when I was like in Portugal, for instance, like there was British people there was Irish people there was Portuguese, like literally everyone, and it was like a really beautiful experience, and me as well getting to see lots of different artists from all across Europe and across the world as well. In many of these venues is like it's kind of opening the doors to make more connections, to make more movements, to meet new people, to meet more labels and stuff. Do you know what I mean? The most interest I've actually had for Great Escape in the sense of meetings and that is from Europe. Nothing's from the UK. Do you know what I mean? So like, yeah, I don't.
So in terms of like if we were going to have more kind of pan-European cultural stuff, do you guys feel like music would be the first place to start?
Yes.
Yes from you? Yes from you as well?
Yes, and film and TV as well. You got loads like this. The European Union passed a law now that, for example, Netflix has to broadcast at least 30% productions from European countries, which is a good start, I think. And maybe we could think about making legislation as well for festivals or radios as well.
Personally, I feel like music is one thing. When it comes to TV, it's a little bit harder because we obviously have the whole small issue of the fact that we live in a 28-country union with any number of languages spoken here. Maxime, for this TV show that you're working on, which is going to, I think, be in multiple languages, like how are you working around that?
Yeah, so the people paying are French, so half of the show will be in French. But basically, we've decided that when a member of the European Parliament who's French will talk to his assistant, that would be in French. When a French assistant is negotiating with an Irish administrator, it's going to be in English, because it's how it's happening in Brussels. When two Germans will talk to each other, it's going to be in German, because we believe that, you know, with subtitles and everything we can overcome these problems. And I think in general the public, I mean in France and in Italy, the two countries I know best, we dub everything, but it's not the case everywhere in Europe. So I think the public also is, the audience is getting more educated to you know, not switch off the TV if they see something in English or in another language. So yeah, it's going to be a melting pot, because basically when you are in the European Parliament, I mean, you speak some sort of globish, some sort of really bad English, but it's going to be that. So we're going to be given the credit for writing in terrible English.
Excellent! I can't wait to see that.
We have the title for the TV show.
Yeah, it's going to be Le Parlement, the Parliament. Yeah, I mean, people get really lazy with titles now. It's just.
We don't get it. It's an EU story. We don't understand that it's EU story.
But that's the point. When I've written, so the crime novel is called The Compromise. I mean, there is a double entendre in French. It's the compromise or the compromised, because the point is to, you know, ask whether bureaucrats are compromised or if the EU is a tool to make compromise. But the only thing that the publisher said is, please don't put Europe in the title, because otherwise.
Was the same for me.
Exactly. So yeah, the Parliament. Because this is what it is, ultimately. I mean, the European Parliament is a parliament. It's just a club of, like, very, very different people. It's more gender balanced than a lot of parliaments across Europe. It's very much diverse, 24 languages, 28, 27, we don't know, nationalities represented after the elections. So someone who was sitting here was talking about a melting pot and cultural diversity. I mean, step into the European Parliament. The European Commission is another matter. It's an administration. So, as every administration, it's there to be blamed and to be boring. But the parliament is very diverse. It's full of life. And this is why we decided that it's going to be called the parliament. And people clicking on it will not realize instantly it's about the European Union.
You're going to trick them then.
Exactly. I mean, this
Excellent.
is what the EU does. It tricks you, doesn't it?
But can I just ask you both about why your publishers said, please, if anything, do not call it anything with Europe in the title?
Well, I guess that they know that when you got Europe in the title, it's not selling good. So I negotiated and I got Brussels in the title. But my first title was La Construction Européenne, because there's a double meaning with like architecture, of course, but also European construction.
You French writers seem to love your double meanings in
Yeah.
your headlines. It's a theme.
We're good at that.
And they thought that the European adjective was not good, so we found Bruxelles Chantier, which is sexier to lots of French people because Brussels is hype and stuff like that nowadays. So it's, I don't know how you negotiate it, but that's the way.
No, I mean, actually, we talked with the publisher, and in fact, we agreed. Because, I mean, before the European election, they will have a lot of essays. Europe is bad, Europe is great, the euro should be destructed, we should get out of Europe, Europe is our destiny, these kind of things. So we wouldn't want to mix with this market, because we've issued a crime novel in February, so just before the election. And we didn't want to be mixed with these, philosophers and thinkers and grandees publishing about the European Union. On the other hand, the cover is inspired by the European flag, because we are sold in the crime novel sections. And in the crime novel section, you either black and red, or black, red, and a bit white on the margins. So a blue flag is something that people got shocked about. I said, oh God, what's that? I'm just going, I'm going to get that. And it's working rather well. I mean, the book market is terrible. We do a bit better than the average, but the average is very low. So, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a success. But there is an Austrian author, it's called Robert Menas, who came here for several years. So he became a bit of an insider, and he's writing a novel which sold 350,000 copies. The average book sells less than 1,000 copies. We're a bit above that. But he is a massive bestseller in Germany. And it's a novel about the European Commission. So not even the colorful parliament I just talked about, but the administration. And still, this is a best-selling work in Germany. So, the EU can sell.
It can just about, but it is still something that feels really closed off to a lot of people. And even for me, I've been making this podcast for the last year and a half, but we haven't really engaged that much with Brussels. For us, realizing what it is to be European has been more about paying an interest for the first time in like what's really happening in like neighbouring countries, as opposed to like what's happening here in Brussels. Ludovic, you've looked obviously a lot at the architecture of like the physical buildings around the European district in Brussels. What were your kind of first impressions of these buildings, beyond thinking that they're like really they look really financial? Do they look closed?
Well, it kind of changed because there is also a before and after the les attentats, in 2015. Yeah, the terrorist attacks in 2015. Then there has been a wave of security buildings, etc. So it changed a bit. But just maybe for the first question you asked about this question of shared culture, and music could be one, but I also think that architecture could be another one. And for instance, in my book, I'm working on why is the European Parliament such a weird place. I don't know, we could discuss this, but well, the history of the European Parliament is that it has been built in Brussels as a center for conferences, a private congress, let's say. And it's just been said at the very end of the works that it would become a second parliament for the EU. Because this reason is because the French people wouldn't have said, yes, we're going to build a second parliament in Brussels. So it's all been made en secret. I don't know how you say it in English.
In secret.
In secret, yeah. And to me, it explains a lot about this weird architecture, because lots of the corridors and the offices and the way it's been built does not say anything about the way it works and the political culture inside. And for instance, in my book, there is Paul Magnette, who's like one of the figures of the PS, which is also your French-speaking party. Yeah, partner, yes, and is in favor, for instance, of crashing the European Parliament in Brussels and like inventing another one. There would be like an appel d'offres. I don't know how you say this.
Yeah, like a tender, so you could have a competition for it?
Yeah, exactly. Of lots of architects Europe-wide, with lots of like what shape to give to a new European Parliament. So this is, of course, is very complicated and it's a very thorny issue for Brussels and like regarding to lots of people here and the history of Brussels. But I think it could be interesting also to say, well, what's the standard, what's the shape today of what should be the heart of the European districts? And this could be like an example of a shared culture story.
Eurovision for architecture then. Love it. Now, Edwin, if you are lucky enough to get elected in a couple of weeks' time, you will be walking these corridors of power inside the European Parliament. Does the kind of language that they use in there, does that kind of scare you a bit? It's very different from the background that you have working in the music industry where everything's really kind of human.
To be honest, I don't know. Maybe the people I know that I met already who are working in the European Parliament are all very friendly, down to earth, intelligent people, real Europeans. All the people on the list are people who are in the first place Europeans and then Flemish, and see Europe as a solution for a lot of the problems facing our society at the moment. That's also why I applied to be candidate on the list, also because I'm Dutch. So that's the only list I can be a candidate on. But I feel really European with German brother-in-law, Brazilian sister-in-law. It's not Europe, but my family is really diverse. So that's why I wanted to run as a candidate for the European Parliament. And to be honest, I never wear a suit, and I don't want to go wear a suit if I get elected anyway. So,
Katy, can I jump in? Just you said there are a lot of like very lovely people in the European Parliament. They're really nasty ones too. I mean, but also the thing is, I mean, you have Emmanuel Macron on the cover of your podcast.
Screaming, yes.
Yeah. There is a thing though, is that now we have actual villains. Whether you think Macron is the villain or you think the extreme right is a villain, politically it's very dangerous because you say, there is one extreme or the other. But from a narrative point of view, I mean, nowadays you've got the anti and the pros. I mean, in Brexit case, you've got remain or leave. So you have a good story to tell. I mean, again, politically speaking, it might be dangerous. And again, bringing conflicts into politics is always a tricky issue. But from a narrative point of view, I mean, Brexit has been a boon. Because all of a sudden you've got characters. All of a sudden you've got everything that happens in Brussels with people finally get interested in. You've got new episodes every week. I mean, it's a bit like Walking Dead. I think there are way too many episodes. But, it just goes on and on and on. But the thing is, back in the days, Europe was just all lovely bureaucrats taking care of Europe and the markets and doing that for the good of the consumers or the citizens. But now all of a sudden, you've got villains. Either you think the bureaucrats are the villains or the extreme right or the extreme left are the villains. At least there is a contest. And this is what politics is also about, clashing a little bit.
I'm really happy that happened now. This is the first time that there really is a discussion about European issues at the moment. In Belgium, it's less than in other European countries, because in Belgium you also have the general elections for the federal and the regional parliaments. But this is the first time that people are really talking about big issues like climate, like fair taxing, and that European policy really is an issue to the people in the streets. Also with the extremist parties, the parties who want to leave Europe, who want to close the borders. So personally, I'm in favor that for the first time European issues are being talked about by people, normal people in the street who don't know how the European institutions work. Maybe we should explain that a bit better than is the case now, but I'm happy with that.
At the same time, and I don't know if this is just because I'm British, but certainly my friends at home in Britain aren't really talking about the European elections that much. I don't know if it's like a youth issue thing. Bobbie, I see you shaking your head. Are your friends talking much about what's happening in the European elections?
No. I don't think the EU is kind of put into the minds at all from like when you grow up. I mean, I had to be honest, I'll be really honest, man. Like, I only started really being like, oh my God, the EU, when Brexit happened. Like, let's be real, innit? When something was getting taken away from me, then I was like, oh, okay, I need that. But like, you know, I think if we start like putting it in schools a bit more, like there was nothing about the EU in schools, at my school anyway. And things like that, I think it could make a huge difference and a huge change in people's awareness and care and understanding why the movement of people is so important and being for that rather than being like, no, I'm going to barricade myself on this tiny little island and not let anyone in. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah.
Is there any way that the EU, because the EU doesn't really have like the coolest of images, which I think is partly because of this whole like having to use this language that everyone can agree on, which is often like the most boring form of language. Is there any way that the EU could make itself seem like something that is cool?
I think more events, do you know what I mean? Or like, I mean, I'm going to say something, I'm not sure if it happens already, like kind of making sure more like student exchanges happen so that, and not just for like more well-off kids, you know, across the board, to, you know, get a view into another city. Like the sickest thing about going to another city is finding out about its culture, innit? You just like, you go like, bumble around for a while and be like, oh, what's this venue? Let me go in here. Do you know what I mean? That should be a lot easier to do than it is. And maybe more funding in that sense when people are younger so they get that kind of like, that thirst for wanting to go see other things instead of being just stuck in your area or stuck like whatever area that is, do you know what I mean? Like not being able to get out and then blaming other people for that reason that you can't get out, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think when we were chatting before, Maxime, we were talking, and you were saying that Europeanness is a really lovely thing, but it is something that often just belongs to kind of like the privileged ones that work in this kind of Euro elite and speak really good English and get to travel a lot, or people who are like migrant labourers or whatever, you know, they might be from Eastern Europe moving to Britain in looking for a job and that kind of thing. I think you would make the argument that culture and like more shared culture, more TV that's set in Europe and stuff like that could help bridge that gap a little bit.
Yeah, because, I mean, all of a sudden you're going to see what other... I mean, I was watching an Iranian movie yesterday, and I really felt for these characters. You know, it was about a divorce, and it's called a separation, and I've got no clue about Iranian culture. But all of a sudden I could see, you know, my parents went through a divorce, it was bad for me, and then I could feel for them. And all of a sudden you realize, well, Iranians are living far away from me, but all of a sudden they feel very close. I still believe that crossing a border is what makes you really European. I mean, I didn't speak a word of English when I was 18, and I failed my A level in English. So this is why I went to London working in a bar. And then working with Poles, Italians, I haven't met any British people when I was working in London in a cafe, but walking also with Indians, or people from Nigeria, or even Americans, I realized that Europeans, we had something, we didn't really have to talk that much, but we could understand each other. You know, we had this weird way with the Italians of not having 3 liters of coffee every day, we'd have a little short coffee. Belgians do it very, like, 2 liters. But instantly, because I crossed the border, but I'm one of the privileged, because then I went on an Erasmus program. Actually, things are changing a little bit, because now, I mean, again, I'm going to promote that because I've worked on it. But the European Parliament has decreased the funding for people who don't have an A level, so apprentices, to work elsewhere. Because back in the days, they used to do that only for a couple of weeks. So people at university would be able to go abroad for a year. People on an apprenticeship would go just for 2 or 3 weeks. But it's because there's a lot of legal consequences. If you work in a kitchen, you can hurt yourself. Your employee can be responsible. So we're putting more money on this. But definitely, I mean, when you cross a border, all of a sudden you feel something different. I was 100% French until I went to London. That's the paradox. And then I realized, fuck, I'm European. Yeah. But you know, it would cost a lot of money to send everybody abroad. But I think, you know, we should. Maybe we should.
But if we can't, could maybe more TV and more music and stuff like that, that's a way that you can kind of travel to Europe without leaving your sitting room, right? At the same
Absolutely.
time. Now, all this amazing shared culture sounds really great, but at the end of the day, we'd have to pay for it somehow. I was really interested to find out just how little money is actually ploughed into building a shared culture. At the moment, Creative Europe, which is the body that funds the culture and creativity sector at the European level, they get 0.15% of the European budget. Now, that could change after the next budget. The European Commission and the European Parliament have both backed doubling that money. And they've also backed like extra support for the music industry as well. But it's something that we still need to see happen. Edwin, if you become an MEP, are you going to kind of back ploughing more money into this kind of shared culture?
Yes, I do. But
He's running for the socialists, huh?
But on the other hand, I do think that even more important is putting more money in, like you said as well, cultural exchange programs. I think that's more important. Sometimes I do believe as well that sometimes there's too much money being put in some programs, musical or also in the movie industry, put in programs that are really not well known and are not used the way that they should be used. Like there's too little communication about all the projects that are possible, all the grants that you can get from Europe to get your culture product out. So I think there's a long way to go first in communication from the European Union towards all the people working in the cultural sector. Like it's almost 12 million people in Europe working in the creative sector. And there's only very few projects being funded and not always the right ones, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Bobbie, for you as a European artist, or until now a European artist, you might be about to become a non-European artist. If there was more funding for the music industry coming from the EU itself, what kind of difference would that make for you as a performer?
I think it would enable me to do my business a lot better. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think being paid, like, to be honest, Europe already pays a bit better than the UK musically. But being paid better, like travel being kind of added to your budget and everything like that, just helps you. Do you know what I mean? It helps you on to the next show. Because as I said before, like the most important thing for an artist is being able to network and being able to meet people and being able to go to many cities, stand on the stage. And like even if you're performing to 1,000 people, if you connect with 10, you connect with 10, and then you connect with another 10. Do you know what I mean? You need to be able to do that. So, you know, I think having the funding there would enable that a lot better, I think. And also for younger, like funding from the EU for younger musicians, you know, like that being, I don't know if it's there already, I hope it is. Like, you know, the youth, because like, you know, I work with kids back home and I do music production, just like a girls group. And it would be the sickest thing to be able to like take them to another city and see what other girl groups in production are doing. And I think it just, you know, creating links wherever you go is the most important thing.
So just in the last 5 minutes before we open it to some questions, I'd like to bring you all back to the kind of title of this conversation, which was, if I could start again, I would start with culture, and ask you all, do you agree with that? Should the European Union have started by trying to build a shared culture?
I do, but I do think that education is even more important and more cultural exchange.
Ludovic?
Yeah, of course I do. Just if I can share a short experience, because we're always talking about like this Erasmus program, and it's fantastic for sure. It happens that I decided not to go to Erasmus program, and I wanted to go to Buenos Aires, Argentina, when younger, like when I was 20 or something like that. And I always thought that it was cooler and more interesting to go further, and that South American politics was more interesting, etc. And it happens that 15 years afterwards, I'm sort of specializing myself on EU stories. But as an example of like what for instance, I would make a connection with like the Kunstenfestival des Arts, which happens to be the big festival nowadays in Brussels, like each month of May, nowadays in Brussels. And it happens to me, it's always been like one of the most exciting experience as a European citizen, but also because it questions my relationship to Europe and to the world outside. I mean that what's interesting also is to understand how Europe works, but at a very special moment when you got Bolsonaro in Brazil and when you got like lots of right-wing movements all over the world, etc., etc. So just to open like the EU institutions, to open the reclos, I don't know how you say it in English, but
closed doors.
yeah, like, and just like think a bit like including like I would say that.
Great. Maxime.
Just one thing on the Erasmus, it became immensely popular in France and in Germany through a movie. I don't know if L'Auberge Espagnole was
But-
something big in the country you're from.
Yeah, I think it was kind of big in England. It's called like the Youth Hostel or something like that. Something like that.
Maybe after the TV series, people would just, want to become bureaucrats and just get into the European institutions. Why not? If we should have begun with culture, to be honest, I think that would have been a mistake, and we wouldn't have gone that far. I'm a liberal, so I believe that starting with the economics was the only way after the war to start something. I mean, we've put it to a vote to a lot of people in Europe. In France, we've asked people, do you want a European defense? Do you want a lot more politics? And people just said no, because after the war, there was no space for politics, I guess. So I think the way it was done was actually a good idea. No, it needs to get a hell of a lot better, because it's going down the drain now, if it just stays a market.
Bobbie, what do you think? Should we have started with culture?
Yeah, I'm going to go with yeah.
I thought you might say that.
I think after the war especially, like with everything that happened, I think being able to share each other's experiences and things like that through music, art, whatever. Maybe it did happen, I don't know, I haven't done my research on that. I'm sure it did in a way. But, I think shared experience is one of the most important things, and sharing ideas and different artistic forms should be the way forward in everything, really.
Very well said. Well, thank you all very much. I think we'll open it now to any questions, if there are any. There is a microphone at the back. No one. One of you must have a question, or just a thought or a comment. I mean, what do you think? Does everyone agree? Does everyone here really strongly agree or disagree with the statement that the European Union maybe should have started with culture when we were thinking about integrating? Yep, at the back there.
Yeah, hello. It will be more a comment than a question. My name is Audrey Guerre. I work for LiveDMA, European network for live music venues, clubs and festivals. I was just a little bit surprised by your last answers, because I think that maybe you wouldn't start with culture, because you see culture as I feel like a one box next to other boxes, but I feel like if we see culture as a very transversal topic, then I think it's the perfect tool to launch many discussions from, as you mentioned, the representation of Europe in the world, about education, about markets and economics. It's actually, I think, a door to reach lots of topics, and it's maybe the right door to open these topics, to have the culture as the angle to reach all of these topics. So this is why, for me, I would start with culture.
Anyone like to reply to that?
Just yes, that's it.
What she said.
True.
Yep, comment at the front here.
Hello, my name is Søren Stavn from the Nordic Culture Fund. The Nordic collaboration actually started with culture, and it's still going on, and it's quite strong. So that's just an interesting point of view to put in here.
So
That
it's
it started
between Nordic culture, the
And
different
the
Nordic countries.
Nordic states collaborate. It's like a mini EU, but it's one of the starting points was culture.
And when we
to
talk
get
about
that
culture,
started.
like what kind of thing?
Culture in a broad sense, but also especially the arts and research in art and networking, collaboration, dialogue through art and culture.
Thank you. Comment at the back there.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Angel. I'm working for Impala. Here we represent European labels, independent labels in Europe. And just wanted to bounce back on your last comment, and especially the Erasmus story, because I did Erasmus as well and I loved it, as many people here, I guess. But so you say that it's important to enhance European culture through this kind of programs and events, and so my question would be like, and especially maybe targeting you, Mr. Korver, because you will be part of the construction maybe of the next program, so why not maybe focus also on developing this kind of networks like Liveurope, who is organizing these events, and other maybe to enhance a bit this kind of travel and networking opportunities between artists and also other, any other people actually in Europe who is interested in meeting other Europeans. Thank you.
Yeah, that's true. I do believe as well that Europe should invest more in like cultural gatherings with other people, not only in music but also in movie industry, in architecture, in arts, and as well as broadening the Erasmus program to people who are not who didn't study, but also to people maybe in high school, to go abroad for a week to another country. And when I was young, I lived in Sint-Truiden, which is like 10 kilometers from the French-speaking part of Belgium. And we went, in the last year, we went for 2 weeks to Wallonie to host family to follow courses over there. And then 2 weeks later, there was a friend who was coming over to our house. And I learned a lot about the French-speaking part of Belgium, the French culture, about food, about the language. I learned to speak a bit better French, because before that was really awful. Things like that should be happening more and more in Europe. Even in Belgium, that doesn't happen anymore. It's very rare that people in high school get to meet people from the other, the French-speaking part of Belgium, and I think that's a big shame. The only part in Belgium where you hear different languages is Brussels. Brussels is, I really love Brussels. I lived here for 15 years, and that's the only really international cultural melting pot in Belgium, and even maybe in Europe, together with like London, Paris maybe as well. But
yeah, I've got to say that high school exchanges can be an amazing experience for just like, it was my first experience of any kind of other culture, really. We spent a week in Germany. I've got to say there was a lot of underage drinking that got done, and that was mostly how we all bonded. But still, it was a really nice shared cultural experience. I don't know if anybody else here has any kind of experience like that.
Can I ask a nasty question to the next MEP? I used to work on the budget committee, so you know all that stuff about money we used to talk about. My question to the MEP is, where would you cut if you increase the money in culture? Because the problem with the EU budget is that there is no EU taxation power. So if you want more money to the budget, you have to have the other programs to go down. I know this is not what we all like, but this is the politics of the EU as it is now. So would you take money away from the French farmers, from the Spain fishermen, from the Polish workers? Where would you cut?
I'm a socialist, so what I first would do is make sure that that all the tax invasion that is happening now with the TVA carousels. There was today a big article in the Tijd with the TVA carousels. It's like 15 billion euro every year that is like evaded by tax carousels in Europe. People buying without TVA and selling it again in another country with TVA, stuff like that. I think there is a big budget that can be cut, and for TVA there's a small part that's going directly to the European Union.
Are you happy with that answer, Maxime?
I think it's a very good political question, a political answer. The problem is that if you would do that, that wouldn't go to the EU budget. And that's the problem. It would go down in the pockets of the member states. So same question again. If you're an MEP and you have to do next year's budget, where do you cut? You don't have to answer that. I was just being nasty. I'm a contrarian.
Are there any more questions from the audience? Or any more comments in general? I mean, do you guys agree with the comment? I'd start with culture, if you were starting the EU from scratch. Yeah, at the back there.
Hello, my name is Benoit. I work in a consultancy specialized in culture called Katy. And I just want to make a link with the previous panel discussion where this Polish artist said that the Turkish love their culture or like begin to like their culture more when they see that the Westerners are liking Turkish music like old rock, psychedelic rock. And what I find interesting is that in Europe there is this Euroscepticism and not very huge interest into the European projects by the citizens. But when we look from the outside, when I never traveled a lot actually outside of Europe, but when you meet people, you see that they have a very huge enthusiasm about the European project. And so this is just like, I don't know, a mirror that I see an interesting link. That even though the European project is quite liked at the global stage, let's say, Europeans don't like it. It's just a thought.
I mean, that's in a way our shared culture. We all hate ourselves, so that's nice, isn't it?
True.
Any further comments on that? Anyone else like to chip in? Great. Well, I think we can call that about a day. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for taking part.
Well, thank you very much for our moderator and our speakers for this last panel session of the afternoon, and thank you to our audience for joining us for this event. I hope you had interesting and thoughtful exercise for you. Right now we will have a small drink and a few things to eat at the Abbé Café. So if you'd like to join us, you're obviously welcome. Well, thank you very much.